Have you ever experienced this moment? Have you ever experienced that moment? Maybe it came after a shattering spiritual revelation, or perhaps it was just the quiet breakdown of an old identity. You feel as if the ground beneath your feet has shifted. Everything once familiar now seems distant and strange. You've pierced through the veil of illusion, seen the machinery of your old patterns, and heard the deafening noise of the world for what it is. And then comes the silence. At first, this silence might feel sacred, even empowering, like stepping out of a burning building and taking your first breath of fresh air. But slowly and subtly, meaning seems to fade away. Not as a tragedy, but as a quiet vanishing, as if your soul has turned off the lights of life and simply forgotten to turn them back on. You stop striving, you stop performing, not out of despair, but from a kind of sacred exhaustion, an emptiness that, strangely enough, feels peaceful, and yet so still it's almost frightening. And then a quiet question begins to whisper, why do I feel so empty now that I've finally seen the truth? This is the paradox no one warns you about. We're led to believe that spiritual awakening will ignite purpose, that seeing through illusions will fill us with burning clarity. But for many, especially the sensitive, the seekers, the empaths, the inner travelers, it does something else entirely. It empties the vessel. It scrapes away all false motivation until even desire itself becomes hard to recognize. And in that void, we mistake awakening for apathy. I remember a conversation with a dear friend, wise, deeply attuned to the spiritual journey. She had seen through the illusions of identity, achievement, and external love. But 2 months later, I found her lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, adrift in a stillness she never expected. She said, I used to cry because I wasn't doing enough. Now I don't care if I do anything at all. I thought awakening would set me on fire. Instead, I feel extinguished. Carl Jung spoke directly about this threshold. He described it as the sacred land between the collapse of the ego and the birth of the self. It is a liminal in-between space, terrifying in its stillness, where the drives once fueled by persona and social approval dissolve, leaving only the raw clay of what is yet to be formed. This is not a failure. This is individuation, the chrysalis stage of the psyche, where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness before becoming a butterfly. It is the necessary psychological death before rebirth. But we must not mislabel this emptiness as regression, for right in the heart of this void, a deeper call exists, a silent heartbeat of soul truths, waiting to be heard. Not a motivation to prove yourself, but an impulse simply to exist, to move, not for recognition, but out of inner resonance. This is not a message of despair. It's about the moment after awakening, when the old fuel runs out and the new energy is still forming. Jung understood, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Losing your old motivation is not the end. It's the sacred beginning of living not as a mask, but as a soul. Jung's wisdom, the gray zone after awakening. This is the moment to turn to the work of Carl Jung, the great architect of analytical psychology. Long before spiritual awakening was a trend, Jung foresaw this strange silent fog that descends after epiphany. He didn't dress it up in mystical language. He spoke plainly, piercingly, about the soul's plunge into its own depths once the unconscious begins to stir. Jung wrote, enlightenment does not come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And though these words sound poetic, they contain a terrifying truth. Real awakening does not crown you with happiness. It strips you bare. It dismantles the scaffolding of the false self. It initiates a slow, sacred death, the death of the person you once believed yourself to be. This collapse happens within, but its effects ripple outward. Old drives, ambition, achievement, validation fade. The timelines you chased, the goals that once pulled you forward, even the identity structures shaping your relationships, work, and daily rhythms, all blur like mirages under a deeper light. But here's the subtlety. Your ego doesn't disappear. It doesn't die. It simply becomes disoriented. Its old script has burned away, but the new one hasn't yet appeared. The result is not laziness or apathy, but a profound spiritual limbo. You're no longer asleep, but not yet fully awake to what comes next. This is the mystery, what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening phase in alchemy, when the ego has been dismantled, but the self has not yet ascended. In modern terms, it feels like loss of motivation. In Jung's language, it's a sacred pause, a space where the soul retreats inward to rewrite its own myth. Yet our culture fears this silence. Jung warned that the modern world does everything to avoid this stage, pathologizes it, numbs it, medicates it, because it cannot understand transformation that doesn't look like progress. But what you are experiencing is not regression, it is initiation, it's not dysfunction, it's a sacred descent. This is not clinical depression, though it may share its shadows. This is the soul refusing to participate in a life it no longer resonates with. And that, Jung believed, is the beginning of individuation, the sacred becoming of the true self. The gray zone, you're not failing, you're in between. Most people never talk about this phase, do they? The dull ache after the light, the silence after the revelation. But this stillness is not empty. It is formative. If you can learn to stand still within it, to listen to what it asks of you, you may begin to see that what feels like lost motivation is really the start of a deeper alignment. The world says you're lost. Jung would say you're being reshaped by something far more honest. You're standing in that void, feeling the old drives have vanished. Why is that? Jung, who saw the soul's architecture so clearly, had the answer long before awakening, became a hashtag. He understood that your inner chaos is not a mistake, but a sign of profound inner restructuring. Understand this. For most of your life, your energy came from the persona, the constructed self, the mask you wore to fit in and move through the world. This identity, hungry for admiration, validation, applause, is not a flaw. Jung saw it as a necessary stage of human development. He wrote, "Persona is a system of behavior imposed on the individual by the expectations of society. But when you awaken, you see the mask for what it is, a performance. And the performance no longer compels you. You can't keep chasing applause once you realize the stage is made of illusion. What happens then? The goals you once worshipped now feel foreign, empty. They were written by a self that no longer lives in you. This creates a strange inner stillness, like an actor stepping off stage and forgetting their lines. Not from confusion, but because the script no longer resonates with the soul. You feel lost, not because you lack direction, but because you've shed the identity that demanded a destination. You haven't lost your motivation. You've outgrown the kind of fuel that once powered it. What stirs inside you now is not absence, but a sacred pause, a quiet emptiness waiting to be filled by something more real, not forged from performance, but from presence. The ego once drove you. The soul is now waiting, and in that waiting, something holy begins. Jung believed the purpose of life is not to glorify the ego, but to integrate it into a larger, deeper spiritual whole. We're not here to serve the ego's desires, but to refine and align it with the self, the transcendent center connecting us to something greater. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey from fragmentation to inner wholeness. Not to become the celebrated ego, but to become the true self, the emergence of the self. A new flame. The self, unlike the ego, doesn't care for approval or performance. It's not driven by ambition, but by alignment. Its only desire is to express what is true. And so, after spiritual awakening, the soul begins a sacred recalibration. What once felt exciting now feels empty. Your system rejects anything artificial, forced, or untrue, including careers built from insecurity, relationships based on roles, even vision boards written from the ego's old fear of not enough. This inner purification brings both liberation and disorientation. You're shedding what was false, but what will replace it? Jung warned that many get stuck here. Some awaken and fall into spiritual bypassing, confusing transcendence with avoidance. They float above life, call everything an illusion, and convince themselves nothing matters. But detachment is not the same as disconnection. The self doesn't want you to vanish from the world. It wants to incarnate through you. It seeks embodiment, not withdrawal. But before that embodiment, there's a threshold. Jung described it clearly, though few recognize it while inside. It's the gray zone after awakening, the void that arrives not with bliss, but with confusion. It's not poetic, it's not trending. It looks like sitting quietly while the world rushes by, unable to explain who you are becoming. Jung would say, you are not failing, you are in between. You have stepped out of ego, but the self is not yet your foundation. This liminal space is not a mistake. It is initiation, a descent into the unknown that modern culture has no patience for. Stillness is misdiagnosed as laziness. Pausing is mistaken for paralysis. And so you begin to judge yourself. That judgment becomes the wall that blocks the very energy your soul is calling in. This stage is sacred. It is the chrysalis, not collapse. If you can stay here long enough, if you can resist the urge to rush or retreat, you will begin to feel it, the quiet pulse of something deeper rising. The self isn't loud, but it is steady, and it waits for you to trust what cannot yet be named. This is why your old motivation is gone. The old fuel has run dry. But a new energy is forming in the silence. You are not broken. You are being reshaped by something far more real. The shadow work, the foundation of wholeness. In this stillness, this nothingness after awakening, the unconscious rises, not as a villain, but as a messenger. What you once suppressed, grief, anger, unmet needs, begins to surface, because now there is finally space for it. This is the foundation of what Jung called shadow work. It's not some advanced spiritual level, it is the bedrock of becoming whole. Shadow work is the integration of those unconscious, rejected, uncomfortable parts of ourselves. As the shadows rise, the ego panics. It wants action, clarity, some label to cling to. But the self whispers, quietly and persistently, let go. Something deeper is forming. And this is where the real work begins. Not in achievement, but in surrender. Not in immediate clarity, but in witnessing. Your psyche isn't malfunctioning. It's metabolizing years of noise, illusion, and false striving. It pauses your drive, ambition, and hunger, leaving you no choice but to sit with what you've buried. This process is like the chrysalis stage. The caterpillar dissolves before it becomes the butterfly. It's the psychological death required for rebirth. Jung said transformation begins in darkness, not in avoidance or chasing only positive vibes. The new impulse, emergence of soul-led motivation. It's in the silence, in the haunting void, that you begin to remember. And then, almost imperceptibly, something stirs. A new kind of motivation appears. But it's nothing like the old. It doesn't arise from anxiety. It's not urgent or performative. It doesn't roar. It hums. This is a soul-led impulse to act, not because you have to, but because not doing so would betray what's true. Jung called this the emergence of the self. The self isn't some abstract ideal, but a living, breathing compass inside. It doesn't chase, it calls. And what it calls you toward is not success, but wholeness. Living from the self doesn't mean you'll always be energized or certain. Fatigue, doubt, and sorrow will still visit. That's the texture of human life. But what disappears is the dull ache of self-betrayal, the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer fits. Instead, something changes. You find yourself creating even when no one applauds, saying no even when others expect yes, following wonder, not just completing to-do lists. You begin to choose peace over performance. This is not stagnation, it's a new fuel, not adrenaline, but alignment, not pressure, but presence. Jung called this living symbolically, not escaping into fantasy, but returning to soul. You begin to trust the language of dreams, intuition, symbols, and synchronicity. Your life becomes a conversation, not a monologue. New questions arise. What is quietly calling me? Where is life nudging me? What feels true? You stop trying to dominate life and start participating with it. Ambition doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes devotion. Devotion to what is real, what is right, what brings you alive. And that devotion moves mountains. It gets things done, but from wholeness, not depletion. Now it is sustainable. Now it is soul-powered. This is the motivation of the self, not to impress, but to express. And that often leads you, almost effortlessly, to create, to teach, to heal, to serve. Not because you should, but because your whole being says yes. So if you're wondering where your fire has gone after awakening, it hasn't disappeared. The old fire burned away so a deeper flame could rise, a flame that will not be extinguished by the storms of the world. Jung promised no easy path, but he promised depth. If you're here reading this, it's not the end of your awakening. It's the beginning of your becoming. The symbolic life, living from soul. As this new energy emerges and the self begins to lead, your life takes on a different quality. Jung called this living symbolically. This isn't about escaping into fantasy. It's about returning to soul. A symbolic life is guided not by ego or social convention, but by the deeper forces of the soul. When the self leads, you stop hustling and start responding to life. Motivation is no longer fear of missing out, but quiet trust in inner synchronicity. You stop hunting for clarity as a prize and start recognizing it when it arrives, often in the simplest things. Living from the self doesn't mean you're always full of energy or certainty. Fatigue, doubt, and sorrow are part of the human tapestry. But gone is the dull pain of self-betrayal, the exhaustion of performing a self that no longer fits. Instead, something shifts. You find yourself creating for its own sake, saying no when necessary, following wonder instead of just ticking off tasks. You choose peace over performance. In the symbolic life, you begin to trust the language of dreams, gut instincts, symbols, and synchronicities. Your life becomes a dialogue, not a shout into the void, but a conversation with the unseen. You ask different questions. What is quietly calling me? Where is life nudging me? What feels true? You stop trying to control life and start participating with it. Ambition doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes devotion. Devotion to what is real, what is right, what brings you alive. And strangely, that devotion can move mountains. It helps you get things done, but from fullness, not depletion. Now it's sustainable. Now it's soul-powered. The self's drive is not to impress, but to express. And that almost effortlessly brings you to create, teach, heal, serve, not because you should, but because your whole being says yes. If you're at this stage, feeling your old fire has gone out, remember, it hasn't disappeared. The old flame burned away so a deeper one could emerge, one that won't die in the world's storms. Jung didn't promise ease, but he promised depth. This isn't the end of your awakening. It's the beginning of your true becoming. Going through the numb or unmotivated phase after awakening is not a failure or regression. It's the sacred beginning of living as a soul, not a mask. Jung believed the purpose of life is not to glorify the ego, but to integrate it into a greater, deeper spiritual whole. This is the lifelong journey of individuation, from fragmentation toward inner unity. The loss of old motivation, driven by persona, by the need for external approval, is not the end, but the clearing. The old flame burns out so a deeper one can rise, a flame not extinguished by the world's storms. The source video emphasizes, if you feel lost in the fog after awakening, or if your old fire has gone out, you are not broken. You are undergoing a profound psychological transformation. It's so powerful. It's restructuring your inner architecture. Jung never promised an easy path, but he promised depth. This is not the end of your awakening, but the beginning of your becoming. If these words have resonated with something inside you, if this language reflects your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Your story, unfinished as it may be, could be the lantern in someone else's darkness. If you know someone silently struggling with illusions of love, self-sacrifice, or unworthiness, consider sharing this video. The aim is to remind them, true love does not ask us to shrink ourselves, and genuine connection does not demand the sacrifice of the soul. Subscribe and enable notifications to continue exploring the depths of psychology, the subconscious, and the mirrors found in our relationships. Leave your topics, questions, or wounds you want to explore in future videos below. This space exists because of you, and your voice is not only welcome, it's essential. Thank you for being here, not just watching, but for engaging in the sacred inner work of remembering who you truly are. And let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. For from that wholeness, all true things are born.